Something extraordinary happened in the dead of night that reveals far more than just one man's frustration. What we're witnessing isn't simply a political meltdown, it's a fundamental shift in how power operates in 21st century America, and the implications reach far beyond our borders. When a former president finds himself issuing statements at midnight, when the carefully constructed image begins to crack under pressure, we need to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about the state of American democracy, the fragility of political institutions, and the changing nature of leadership in our time? The truth is, this moment represents a convergence of legal pressures, political isolation, and the psychological toll of watching a legacy unravel in real time. We're seeing the intersection of constitutional accountability, the limits of executive power, and the consequences of choices made years ago now coming due. This isn't about partisanship. It's about understanding how quickly fortunes can reverse in modern politics, how the systems designed to check power actually function when tested, and what this means for America's standing on the global stage. The world is watching, and what happens next will reshape not just domestic politics, but international perceptions of American stability for years to come. Now, to understand what's really happening here, we need to step back and look at the broader picture, because what appears to be a singular moment of crisis is actually the culmination of forces that have been building for years. The midnight statements, the increasingly frantic tone, the sense of walls closing in, these aren't random occurrences. They're symptoms of a much deeper transformation taking place in American political life, one that has profound implications not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire structure of governance and accountability in the United States. Let's consider what we're actually witnessing. For decades, American politics operated under certain unwritten rules, certain assumptions about how power would be exercised and how leaders would conduct themselves. There was an understanding that even in the most partisan battles, certain boundaries would be respected. The peaceful transfer of power, the acceptance of electoral outcomes, the subordination of personal interest to constitutional duty, these weren't just nice ideas. They were the bedrock upon which the entire system rested. But what happens when those assumptions are challenged? What happens when a political figure decides that the old rules no longer apply to them, that they exist somehow beyond the reach of accountability? The answer, as we're seeing play out in real time, is that the system begins to assert itself. The institutions that were designed more than 2 centuries ago to prevent the concentration of power, to ensure that no individual could place themselves above the law, start to function exactly as they were intended. The courts proceed with their cases. The prosecutors present their evidence. The processes of justice, however slow and frustrating they might seem, continue to move forward. And for someone who spent years operating as though they were immune from consequences, this assertion of institutional authority represents nothing less than an existential threat. Think about the psychology at work here. Imagine spending your entire life crafting an image of invincibility, of being someone who always wins, who never backs down, who bends reality to their will through sheer force of personality. Now imagine watching that carefully constructed facade begin to crumble, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical, grinding machinery of legal proceedings and institutional accountability. The frustration, the rage, the sense of betrayal, these aren't just personal emotions. They're the natural reaction of someone confronting the reality that the rules do, in fact, apply to everyone. But here's where it gets truly fascinating from a geopolitical and structural perspective. The United States has always positioned itself as the world's leading democracy, the shining example of how democratic institutions can create stability, prosperity, and justice. American leaders have lectured other nations about the rule of law, about the importance of democratic norms, about the necessity of peaceful transitions of power. The entire post-World War II international order was built, in large part, on the assumption of American democratic stability. So, when that stability appears to be in question, when the world watches an American president refuse to accept electoral defeat, when they see years of legal battles and constitutional crises playing out in the American heartland, it fundamentally alters global perceptions of American reliability and strength. Our allies begin to wonder if they can truly count on American commitments. If the United States can't maintain basic democratic stability at home, if its political system is consumed by internal conflict and constitutional crisis, How can it possibly serve as the guarantor of international security? How can it lead alliances, negotiate treaties, or provide the kind of steady, predictable leadership that the international system requires? These are not abstract questions. They have real consequences for everything from NATO unity to trade agreements to cooperation on climate change and global health. Meanwhile, America's adversaries are watching with great interest. There's nothing that serves the interests of authoritarian regimes better than seeing the world's leading democracy tear itself apart from within. Every constitutional crisis, every instance of political violence, every moment when American democratic norms are violated provides ammunition for those who argue that democracy itself is weak, chaotic, and ultimately inferior to more authoritarian forms of government. When Chinese state media or Russian propagandists can point to chaos in Washington and say, see, this is what democracy gets you, it undermines decades of American soft power and democratic promotion around the world. What we're seeing now in these midnight outbursts and increasingly desperate statements is a man confronting the reality that the system is stronger than any individual. The courts continue to function. The prosecutors continue to build their cases. The institutions of accountability, however much they've been tested and strained, are holding. And for someone who built their entire political identity on the idea of being beyond the reach of normal rules and constraints, this is nothing short of catastrophic. But let's dig deeper into what this means for the future of American democracy, because the real question isn't just what happens to one individual, it's what precedents are being set, what lessons are being learned, and how this shapes the behavior of future political actors. If the system successfully holds a former president accountable for alleged wrongdoing, it sends a powerful message that no one is above the law, that the institutions of accountability can withstand even the most severe tests. That's enormously important for the long-term health of American democracy. On the other hand, if we see this process drag on indefinitely, if it becomes mired in endless appeals and political maneuvering, if it ultimately fails to reach meaningful conclusions, that sends a very different message. It suggests that with enough resources, enough political support, and enough willingness to push boundaries, powerful individuals can indeed place themselves beyond effective accountability. That would be a devastating blow to the principle of equal justice under law, and it would fundamentally alter the incentive structure for future political actors. Consider, too, the international dimension of all this. The United States exists within a global system of laws and norms, many of which it helped create. There's the International Criminal Court, various human rights conventions, trade agreements with enforcement mechanisms, all sorts of international structures that assume nations will abide by certain rules. But how can the United States credibly advocate for international law and institutional accountability when it struggles to maintain these principles at home? The disconnect between America's international rhetoric and its domestic reality becomes impossible to ignore. This is particularly relevant when we look at how the United States has historically dealt with other nations facing similar crises. American officials have often been quick to condemn other countries where former leaders refuse to accept legal accountability, where political systems become consumed by conflict over the prosecution of former officials, where democratic norms break down under pressure. The standard American response has been to call for respect for judicial independence, adherence to constitutional processes, and acceptance of legal outcomes. But now the United States finds itself in the uncomfortable position of having to apply those same standards to its own situation. What makes this moment particularly precarious is the timing. We're living through a period of intense global instability and competition. The international order that emerged after World War II and solidified after the Cold War is under unprecedented strain. China is asserting itself as a rival power center with an alternative model of governance. Russia is actively working to undermine Western unity and democratic institutions. Climate change is creating new sources of conflict and migration pressure. The global economy is being reshaped by technological change and shifting power dynamics. In this environment, American distraction and internal division represent a genuine strategic vulnerability. Think about what this means in practical terms. When American policymakers are consumed by domestic political crises, they have less bandwidth to focus on international challenges. when American political leaders are viewed as potentially temporary or unstable. Foreign governments are less likely to make long-term commitments based on American promises. When the American public is polarized and exhausted by internal conflict, there's less appetite for the kind of international engagement and leadership that has characterized American foreign policy for decades. We're also seeing something interesting happen with American soft power, that intangible but crucial element of influence that comes from being admired and emulated rather than simply feared. For generations, people around the world looked to America as a model, not because it was perfect, but because it represented the possibility of democratic governance, economic opportunity, and individual freedom. When that model appears to be failing, when American democracy looks chaotic and dysfunctional, it diminishes American influence in ways that are hard to quantify, but deeply consequential. Now, let's bring this back to the immediate situation. The midnight statements, the sense of panic, the increasingly erratic behavior, these aren't just personal failings, they're signals of a broader reckoning taking place. For years, there was a kind of understanding that certain political norms were merely guidelines, suggestions that could be bent or broken without serious consequences. That understanding is now being tested in the most direct way possible. The legal system is asserting that actions have consequences, that power comes with accountability, that the rule of law isn't just a slogan, but an enforceable reality. This creates an interesting dynamic because we're essentially watching a stress test of American democratic institutions play out in real time. Can the courts remain independent in the face of political pressure? Can prosecutors pursue cases against powerful political figures without being intimidated or compromised? Can the media continue to report accurately despite accusations of bias and attacks on press freedom? Can the public distinguish between legitimate legal proceedings and politically motivated persecution? These are the questions that will determine whether American democracy emerges from this period stronger or fundamentally weakened. There's also the question of what this means for political culture going forward. If we establish that former presidents can be held legally accountable for their actions, it might encourage more responsible behavior from future leaders who know they won't enjoy perpetual immunity. Alternatively, it might create a precedent where every change in administration leads to prosecutions of the previous administration, turning the legal system into just another arena for political warfare. The distinction between these outcomes depends entirely on whether the public comes to view these proceedings as legitimate exercises of legal accountability or as partisan witch hunts. From a global perspective, other nations are learning lessons from this as well. Democracies around the world are watching to see whether the American system can successfully navigate this crisis. If it can, it provides a model for how democratic institutions can hold powerful leaders accountable. If it can't, it suggests that perhaps the authoritarian critique of democracy, that it's too weak and divided to function effectively, has some merit. The stakes, in other words, extend far beyond American borders. What's particularly striking is how this moment reveals the tension between different conceptions of leadership and accountability. In some political cultures, leaders are expected to be above the fray, immune from the kind of scrutiny and legal jeopardy that ordinary citizens face. The idea is that to effectively lead, one needs to be insulated from constant challenges and investigations. But the American system, at least in theory, was designed around the opposite principle, that leaders are merely temporary custodians of power, bound by the same laws as everyone else and subject to accountability when they leave office. This philosophical difference is now being tested in the most concrete way possible. The midnight timing of these outbursts is itself revealing. There's something about the deep night, when the world is quiet and the filters of daylight propriety fall away, that reveals underlying psychological states. When someone is composing statements at midnight, when they can't sleep because of the pressure and anxiety, when they're lashing out in the small hours, rather than waiting for the considered counsel of advisors and lawyers in the morning, that tells us something about the internal state of crisis they're experiencing. It's the behavior of someone who feels cornered, who sees their options narrowing, who understands at some level that the situation is genuinely dire. As we watch this unfold, it's worth remembering that these moments of crisis can be turning points in a nation's history. They can lead to renewal and strengthening of democratic institutions, or they can mark the beginning of democratic decline. The outcome depends on how various actors respond: judges, prosecutors, political leaders, the media, and ultimately the public itself. If people can distinguish between legitimate accountability and political persecution, if institutions can remain independent while under pressure, if the political system can process this crisis without descending into chaos or authoritarianism, then American democracy might emerge stronger for having been tested. But make no mistake, the test is real and the stakes are genuine. What happens in the coming months will shape American democracy for generations. It will determine how future leaders behave, knowing they might face accountability. It will influence how the world views American stability and reliability. It will affect the balance between democracy and authoritarianism in the global ideological competition. These midnight statements, for all their apparent chaos and emotion, are actually moments of historical significance, data points in a larger story about whether democratic accountability can survive in an age of polarization, misinformation, and concentrated political power. The world is watching, history is watching, and what we do with this moment will matter far more than any of us might initially realize.